Hello class, and welcome to this presentation on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Today we will be going over chapter 1 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So this will be a good review for any of you who missed a class, who would like a little bit of review. I will be going through the entire novel and kind of chatting a little bit about it. First thing is first, whenever we are taking notes, make sure that you have a pen and paper handy. You should be taking your own notes in addition to mine. This is good practice. It will set you up for success in the future. Also, video is a great way of doing this because in class you can't obviously pause me. So you could pause, take notes, go back, re-listen to things, and let's make sure that we get through this novella. So a couple of things that we went over in class and some things I just really want to touch on before we begin. This is a novella, which means it is a short novel of sorts. It was written in Victorian England. And we're going to go over exactly what that means as we read. There are also some notes in class. I'll try to make a video on Victorian England. But it was written a long time ago by a man named Stevenson. Robert Louis Stevenson, but I'll be referring to him by his last name, so if I say Stevenson, I do mean the author. Okay, it was written by Stevenson. He was a Scottish-born gentleman, but our story, as we will notice, is going to be taking place in London. Okay, so both in the UK or in the United Kingdom, which is kind of across the sea from where we currently are, or across the ocean, sorry. So just keep in mind that we're in a bit of a different culture, but something very similar to ours in terms that we are a British colony, or we were a British colony. So similar cultural references that we're going to get. Some things are going to be different, obviously, because, again, it was a long time ago. However, some things we'll come across, and we'll read through it. I'll help explain. Make sure that you are just taking your notes. Okay, so let's start. First thing is first. How do you approach a friend who you believe is in trouble? Think about this for a moment, right? Because this novel is going to center on the idea of somebody is in trouble. Something is happening, and we're really going to see kind of this bond of friendship between several characters in the novel. So I want you right now to kind of pause this video in your notes. Consider this question right here. How do you approach them? Or do you approach them? How do you approach them? Right? Do you wait for them to talk to you? Do you approach them first? Are you simply offering support? How good of a friend do they have to be before you come up to them and say, hey, I noticed something's been going on? So in the class I asked for 5 sentences to be written for me, and this is to go into your writer's notebook as evidence of learning. So if you have not done so, do so now, and show me that you're starting to think about maybe some of the things that we're going to be coming up on in this novel, or this novella. Did you do it? Okay. If you did, all good. If not, pause and take that time. Okay, so we start off this novel, or this novella, sorry, I keep making that mistake. We start off this novella, and novella just means short novel. Short novel. Okay, it's very, very small. With this idea of a door. What do you think a door would symbolize? What do you think a door could stand for? Or what, so symbolism is an image or a symbol that means something. Right? It means something more than what it is. So think about what you do with a door, right? We go in and out of doors. Doors protect us from things. They keep us safe, right? Not all doors have little windows in them, and if they don't, imagine this was all filled in, right? What else could they do? Well, even this one is quite dark. They can hide our secrets. Right? They can keep people out. Or keep them in, keep them locked in. there's a lot that we can kind of have this idea of the door. So, when we start with the door, right, we're starting this whole novella with the story of the door. It's the first kind of image that's being presented to us. So really, what you're going to do is we're going to walk out of this world that we normally are in. If you're on the sidewalk right here, right, you're normally in this world. It's Victorian, so let's put a little top hat there. You're normally in this beautiful world and you know everything around you, but as soon as you enter that door, something's going to happen. Something is going to start. Something is going to be different. We're going to discover something. Now, if the door is full wood, right, we don't have those windows, we don't know what's beyond that door, right? So we're going into this world of the unknown. We have no clue what's going on. But we're starting off and we're going to enter the door. We're going to enter the story. We're going to physically go into the story and see what's going on. So this is where we start. And this is why Stevenson has chosen this symbol of a door. Okay. Let me just make this nice and big. Perfect. I will read through. We're going to consider some of the questions on the side as we go. So the story of the door. Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was of a rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile, cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet, somehow, lovable. At friendly meetings, and when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beckoned from his eye. Something, indeed, which never found its way into talk. Okay, let's pause here. We're already getting an idea of who we're starting with. So, while his name is not in the title, Mr. Utterson right here, he is our narrator. He is going to be the one who is telling our story, right? So Utterson is our narrator. So already we're kind of capturing ideas about what Mr. Utterson is like. Now again, Victorian English, it's going to be something that's a little bit older. We're going to have more difficult words, but let's kind of really peek into this. So he was a lawyer, so we already know one thing about him. Make sure you're taking notes on how many details you can gather. Of a rugged countenance. When you looked at him, he was a strong person, right? He wasn't weak. He was a very strong kind of looking guy. He was never lighted by a smile, right? He isn't smiling, or maybe he's just stern-faced. Cold, scanty, embarrassed in discourse. Discourse is the way you speak. Okay, if he's embarrassed in his discourse, he's embarrassed in the way he speaks. Lean, long, dusty, dreary. We're getting this kind of very drab, just very, very gray almost in my mind kind of picture of this gentleman. Very proper, very English, very Victorian. Right, very reserved. He doesn't tell you what's going on in his mind, but somehow he is lovable, right? And when he is around his friends, something human kind of looks out from his eyes. So we know he's a good guy, right? He's a very to himself kind of person. Something indeed which never found its way into his talk, but which spoke not only in these silent symbols of after-dinner face, but more often loudly in the acts of his life. Okay, he does by acting. He doesn't do by speaking. Like he's very much a man of his word. He was austere with himself, drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages, and though he enjoyed the theatre, had not crossed the door of one for 20 years. But he had an approved tolerance for others. Okay, so he's someone who really enjoys things like theater. He enjoys culture, but for 20 years, he has not gone to see a play. Or in our terms, it would be more like a movie, right? He likes to watch these things and go out and be social, but for 20 years, he hasn't. So is he really social, right? Think about that STEEL acronym that we've been working on, right? Speech, thoughts, effects on others' actions, and looks. Well, it says that he enjoys the theater, right? He thinks about the theater, but his actions show that he's not very, very social, right? He doesn't go out to these plays. And when we're talking about steel, if you're not familiar with this, we're talking about characterization, or what a character is like. Or what a character is really like. Okay? Because you're more than just your words. You're also your actions and your thoughts and how you make other people feel. So we kind of see him as a very to himself sort of guy. Okay, let's go back over to this blue quote. But he had an improved tolerance for others, sometimes wondering, almost with envy, at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds, and in any extremity inclined to help rather than reprove. He is inclined to help people out rather than to judge them or to put them down. Right? So he's a helpful feller. He enjoys to help people. I incline to Cain's heresy, he used to say quaintly. I let my brother go to the devil in his own way. Right? Beautiful quote that Stevenson has written. I really love this one. I let my brother go to the devil in his own way. And he doesn't mean his actual brother. He means other people in society, other men in society in particular. He lets anyone choose how they are going to sin. Right? He doesn't judge them. And think about being a lawyer at this time, right? He would be somebody who would be defending criminals for their actions. He's not going to judge them. He is going to help them. He is not going to sit there and say, you did wrong, therefore I will not help you. He lets them go to the devil in their own way. In fact, he has almost a bit of envy about the fact that other people can bring themselves to do this, right? Because he is so repressed. He is so reserved that he can't even let himself feel what he wants to feel. He pushes that all aside, but he's jealous and he's envious of those who can do what they want without thinking about it. All right, we're going to continue on from this quote. In this character, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and last good influence in the lives of down-going men. And to such as these, so long as they came about his chambers, he never marked a shade of change in his demeanour. No doubt the feat was easy for Mr. Utterson, for he was undemonstrative at best, and even his friendship seemed to be founded in a similar catholicity of good nature. It is the mark of a modest man to accept his friendly circle ready-made from the hands of opportunity, and that was the lawyer's way. His friends were those of his own blood or those whom he had known longest. So, in this time, this idea of being modest, this idea of, and when we talk about this idea of being modest, right, you don't boast, you are thankful for what you have. Thinking of it almost as, in today's terms, almost like a type, not completely, but like a type of being grateful. Okay, he's grateful for what he has, and he accepts his friends from those who are around him. They are his own blood, right? They're from his family. Or those who he had known longest. Who are people that you've known longest? Probably people that you went to school with, people you grew up with. Okay, these are the people that you would have known longest. He doesn't go out and try to find friends, right? He sticks with his friends close to him. So he's a lawyer. He's someone who defends others for their delinquent. Delinquent means to go against society, or you're doing something wrong, for their actions, right? And he's not very social, but he does accept his friends who are around him. All right, so let's continue on. We chatted about that one. His affections, like ivy, were the growth of time. People grow on him. They implied no aptness in the object, hence no doubt the bond that united him to Mr. Richard Enfield, his distant kinsman. A kinsman is a cousin or family member of some kind. So your kinsman could be like your second cousin, your fourth cousin, your great uncle, your aunt, your actual cousin. Your kinsman is those who you would share a family bond with. So as we know, Mr. Utterson doesn't like to make friends. He has friends from those who are around him. This means that Enfield is some sort of family. And his friend. All right, let's continue on. The well-known man about town. It was a nut to crack for many. For these two could see it was a nut to crack for many what these two could see in each other. Right? They don't have similar interests. Or what subject they could find in common. It was reported by those who encountered them in their Sunday walks that they said nothing, looked singularly dull, and would hail with obvious relief the appearance of a friend. For all of that, okay, so they don't really talk a lot while they walk, but for all of that, the two men put the greatest store by these excursions. They really enjoyed them. Counted them the chief jewel of each week, and not only set aside occasions of pleasure, but even resisted the calls of business, that they might enjoy them uninterrupted. They put a lot of store into these walks. They really enjoy being around each other, even though they don't stay a lot. It chanced on one of these rambles, on one of these walks, that their way led them down a by-street in a busy quarter of London. Okay, so now we know we're in London. The street was small and what is called quiet, but it drove a thriving trade on the weekdays. The inhabitants were all doing well, it seemed, and all emotionlessly helping to do better still, and laying out the surplus of their gains in coquetry. There we go. Coquetry is a flirtatious behavior. So, they're really in the streets. We have the stalls. You have to excuse my art. So this is a stall right here. And they're selling their wares. And they're saying, oh, we have the most beautiful apples. Look how great they are. Okay? It's almost flirtatious and like, oh, I'm so great. Look how great we're doing. Everyone's making so much money. Okay? So it's an okay part of town. So the shop front stood along with thoroughfare with an air of invitation like rows of smiling saleswomen. Even on Sunday, when it veiled its more florid charms and lay comparatively empty of passage, the street shone out. In contrast to its dingy neighborhood. Let me make this bigger. In contrast to its dingy neighborhood. So the people there are really friendly. There's a lot great. They're flirtatious. They're doing well. But the neighborhood is not the most amazing. It's a little bit dingy out. Like a fire in the forest, and with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of note, instantly caught and pleased the eye of the passenger. Right, so it's still something that is, it's pleasing to the eye. It's nice to look at, even though it's a little bit dingy. 2 doors from one corner on the left hand going east. The line was broken by the entry of a court. A court is like a stone circle. Think of it that way. And just at the point, a certain sinister block of building thrust forward its gable on the street. Okay, we already have a building being sinister. To be sinister, how do I describe this? Is to be kind of like a creepy looking, that's a C, sorry. A creepy looking building, something that has, like if you're sinister, you have bad intent to do something, right? If there's somebody smiling at you sinisterly, you think that they're going to do something badly against you. So this building, right, is sinister block of building. It's just thrust forward. So we have these beautiful, beautiful house. That's my beautiful house. Beautiful house. Beautiful house. They're all polished. They're all quite nice. Maybe a little dreary, but they're nice. Like they're a little dingy, but they're good. And then we just have this like monstrosity. Okay, and it's thrust out from the rest of them. Those are my drawings. Let's continue on. It was 2 stories high, so we have a big house. Showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story and a blind forehead of discolored wall on the upper, and bore every feature the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. Now, negligence, right here, when you ignore something and it falls into ruin. For example, if you're negligent to water a plant, it will die. Right? If you are negligent to study, your grades may suffer. If you are negligent to eat the proper food, right, have a balanced and varied diet, you might get sick. So negligence is you ignore something. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and distained. The tramps slouched across the recess, tramps being people at this time who were homeless, that's how they called them. Not politically correct anymore, but that's what they used to say. They slouched into the recess, they slouched into the door, and struck matches upon the panels. Children kept shop upon the steps. They would sell things on the steps. The schoolboy tried his knife on the moldings. For one close on a generation, no one had appeared to drive away these random visitors or to repair their ravages. Mr. Enfield and the lawyer were on the other side of the by-street, but when they came abreast of the entry, the former lifted up his cane and pointed. Did you ever remark that door? Okay, again, we have the idea of the door. So this is where the story is starting, really. We are entering into the door. He asked. And when his companion... I just wanted to show you kind of, this would be like a neglected house, right? So we'll see like it's boarded up. It's the wood is starting to rot in places. The house is, the roof is starting to fall into disrepair. So people will be like sleeping right here, right, at nighttime. This is where they're slouching. Little children might be setting up shop, right? This would be their lemonade stand. They would try and make money here because nobody lives here. Okay, so this is kind of a neglected house. Did you ever remark that door, he asked. When his companion had replied in the affirmative, he replied, yes. It is connected in my mind, added he, with a very odd story. Okay, so now we're starting the story. Indeed, said Mr. Utterson, with a slight change of voice. And what was that? Well, it was this way, returned Mr. Enfield. I was coming home from some place at the end of the world about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning. This, I have to say, at the end of the world at 3 o'clock on a black winter morning, this is the best way to kind of start a story. Think about it. At 3 o'clock in the morning, what is going on, typically, or generally? What's happening? Is it something that's going to be good? Do we do good things at 3 in the morning? No, right? We typically do things that are really bad, right? Things that have poor choices. Usually we'll see people who may have been drinking or partying or going out for some non-legitimate reasons. And they would be making bad decisions. Now, that's not to say that everybody does that, right? But this is the image that Stevenson would be trying to invoke, especially back in this time where things like street lamps were not as common. They weren't as bright, right? You'd have a couple of lanterns, and we'll see those. This is my lantern. You'll see a couple of lanterns kind of hanging around, but they weren't as bright as the street lights that we have today. So he's trying to get the reader to think about these negative things that would be going on, because we wouldn't have as many people working night shifts. We wouldn't have as many people going out for more legitimate reasons. Typically, people would want to be home because lawlessness and crime would be more abundant at nighttime. So people would want to kind of sequester themselves at home. But Mr. Enfield is out at 3 o'clock of a black winter morning. All right, let's continue on and see what happens in the story. And my way lay through a part of town where there was literally nothing to be seen but lamps, street after street, and all the folks asleep. Street after street. We're having this repetition. Street after street, all lighted up as if for a procession. Think of like a funeral as a procession, right? So something ominous is going to happen. And all as empty as a church, till at last I got to that state of mind when a man listens and listens and begins to long for the sight of a policeman, right? When people are trying to, think about it at nighttime if you're scared, right? You want to see somebody there who's going to protect you. So we're having this idea that Enfield is starting to get a little bit more scared, right? Nobody is around. There's nothing in the street. Okay, let's continue on. All at once I saw two figures, one a little man who was stumping along eastward at a good walk, and the other a girl of maybe 8 or 10 who was running as hard as she was able to down a cross street. So we have this little 8 to 10-year-old kind of out at nighttime. I don't know why. Well, sir, the two ran into one another naturally enough at the corner. And then came the horrible part of the thing, for the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. It sounds nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. It wasn't a man, it was like some damned Juggernaut. I gave a view holla and took to my heels and collared the gentleman and brought him back. Okay, so one thing I really kind of want to bring about, well, two things. Here we have this man, right? This going down one street. Let's give him a little hat. Okay, he's going down one street. Maybe looks a little bit like a zombie there. And we have this little girl, right? And she's running as fast as she can down this other street. They don't see each other. Boom! They hit. Now, we continue on. This little girl is on the street, and she's lying down, right? And she's probably crying and screaming because she just got hit. And this man is slowly going to trample her. So he kind of walks right over her, and Mr. Enfield even says, it sounds like nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. Right? So he knows it doesn't sound like a lot, but it was hard to see. The man was like a damn Juggernaut, right? This is one kind of comic figure that I was able to pull up. A Juggernaut, think of somebody who is short, but very, very, very strong. That's a muscle right there. That's an arm. Let's put fingers on there. This is why I don't teach art. Right, so he's very strong, he's very short, he's very built, right? We have all of these muscles around, but he's quite short. So he's just saying, like, he's a powerhouse. He's not somebody you want to go against. Okay, the other thing I want to take a look at is this idea, right? Let me use blue for this one. The man trampled calmly over the child's body, right? Right here. And left her screaming on the ground. How can you calmly trample somebody? Trampling, right? And think about it. There would be like kicking and hitting while he's kind of walking over her. To do that calmly, to trample kind of invokes this idea of anger. That's my angry face. And usually when you're angry, you don't do things calmly. So we have this kind of comparison, this what we call juxtaposition. So let's take a look at this juxtaposition. Now, I'm hoping that you're still pausing and taking notes as we go through, because I know I'm running through this quite quickly. This definition will help you. So juxtaposition. Juxtaposition is a literary technique in which two or more, so we could have 3, 4, ideas, places, characters, and their actions are placed side by side in a narrative, so in a story, or a poem for the purpose of developing comparisons and contrasts. We're going to compare how Jekyll is and his anger with this idea of his action of trampling and that idea of being quite calm. So to kind of get the idea of how we're going to put two things side by side that are in contrast, I'm going to use my favorite building. This building is in Toronto, in Ontario. And it's an old museum. This is the museum right here. It's, I don't know the exact age of it, but it's quite old, right? It's this kind of beautiful architecture. I don't know, pretend to know architecture, but it's this beautiful architecture. You go inside, it's quite a beautiful building. But at one point, the ROM, which is what it's called, this museum, the Royal Ontario Museum, one point the ROM wanted more space because it had a bigger collection. And so they hired on this architect. This architect made this beautiful thing. Some people in Toronto love it. Some people hate it. I personally love it. And he built this. So this whole building is one piece, right? We have the older section, very much in contrast with this newer section. And they are complete opposites. There's opposites that can go. Now, the architect could have used this old style. It's possible to have just continued building on. But he or she didn't. They built this kind of really big modern structure with these lines, right? This kind of almost jewel-like effect is what I think about it, like a crystal sort of thing. Like the windows are even a little bit wonky. They're kind of in contrast to how the old windows go. Everything about it is different, and the idea of this building was to, and it literally cuts into the old building, was to put this new, or this old and this new building side by side to show how different architecture can be. They did it to show, or at least this is my interpretation, they did it to show how much times have changed and how, they're to highlight the differences in the architecture. So I think it's a really neat building. This building is kind of a visual representation of this idea of juxtaposition, right? We have two very different things placed side by side, because when you see them side by side like this, you go, whoa, well, that's different. And it gives you pause. You stop to think about it. Okay, so we have this beautiful use of juxtaposition in the way that Hyde is calmly trampling over this girl, calmly doing this kind of really intense action. Okay, let's continue on and see what happens next. Let me make this, okay. So, Mr. Hyde there we go. Mr. Hyde just calmly trampled over this girl, right? And Mr. Hyde, as soon as he did it, he tried to run away. So we have Hyde. And he goes, oh, yeah, that was bad. Haha. And he starts to run away. Where Mr. Enfield was watching this, right? Mr. Enfield's telling us a story about what happened last week. Mr. Enfield was watching this and goes, oh, no, no, no. And he chased after him. And he grabbed him by his collar and pulled him back. Okay. So, let me get the last sentence here. I gave a view holla, took to my heels, collared my gentleman, and brought him back to where there was already quite a group about the screaming child. He was perfectly cool and made no resistance, but gave me one look so ugly that it brought out a sweat on me like running. Okay, so as soon as Mr. Hyde looks at this guy, he's just sweating. The people who had turned out were the girl's own family, and pretty soon the doctor for whom she had been sent put in his appearance. They called a doctor. Well, the child was not much worse, more frightened, according to Sawbones. Sawbones would be the name of the doctor. We don't know the actual name of him. Sawbones would be the way to address the doctor, because I think back in the time when we have the doctor, right? There's his little doctor's hat. I guess it's more of a nurse's hat. At that time, right, if something was happened or something was bad with somebody's leg, for example, right, he would actually cut off his leg. Okay, so Sawbones is kind of how they refer to him. So the doctor says that the girl is more frightened than anything. And there you might have supposed would be an end to it. But there was one curious circumstance. I had taken a loathing to my gentleman at the first sight. Right? This is intense, to take a loathing to someone. You might not like somebody for what they had done, but first sight, he is taken a loathing. This is very emotional, right? We have high emotions running with this man. So he's taken a loathing to Mr. Hyde, or to this gentleman. Sorry, we don't know his name yet. Spoilers. So had the child's family, which was only natural, but the doctor's case was what struck me. He was the usual cut and dry apothecary kind of doctor, of no particular age and color, with a strong Edinburgh accent. Okay, so back to the Scottish roots, and about as emotional as a bagpipe. I mean, there's no better way to describe how someone is not emotional than calling them a bagpipe. Right? He's not emotional. It's like saying he's emotional as a doorknob. So he's someone who doesn't usually have strong emotions, or doesn't show strong emotions. Well, sir, he was like the rest of us. Every time he looked at my prisoner, I saw that Sawbones turned sick and white with a desire to kill him. I knew what was in his mind just as what was in mine, right? So they're both thinking about this thing. And killing being out of the question, we did the next best. We told the man that we could and would make such a scandal out of this as should make his name stink from one end of London to the other. If he had any friends or any credit, we undertook that he should lose them. So he's saying, we wanted to kill this guy, but we couldn't, because we are upstanding Victorian gentlemen who do not do things like murder. But they both wanted to do it, but they're not going to vocalize it, right? They didn't talk to each other. He knew what was in his mind, so they didn't chat about it, because that would be very ungentlemanly. It would be very un-Victorian. We could and would make such a scandal out of this. So we have this idea that scandal is second only to death. Okay? Right, sorry, that's loathing. Do I have... Okay. Sorry. Okay, so we have this idea, right, of a scandal being the next worst thing to death. So think about what this says about Victorian society. What is this telling us about what it means to have your name and your reputation valued? Think about how this would be the next best thing to killing somebody, and what that says about society. I also want to take a moment to take a look at this guy right here. I've taken a loathing to my gentleman at first sight. Think about this idea, like I said before, to loathe. It's an intense kind of hate. It's not like you were annoyed. It's not like you were bothered. It's not like you were uneasy, right? You loathe this person. Think about your reaction to when you loathe something. Can you listen to reason? Usually and typically not, right? If you're loathing, you're kind of really, really upset at that time. Think about why you might loathe something. I love this word to loathe, or this loathing used by Stevenson, because we have this thing called connotation, right? We're looking at what the meaning or the feeling, more like the feeling of the word. This is in contrast to denotation. Denotation is simply the dictionary definition. But some words, right, when we're going this idea of what it means to hate, some words mean it a little bit less, right? If you're annoyed by something, yeah, you don't like it, but maybe you don't quite hate it. If you're bothered, if you're uneasy, if you hate it, loathe is like the most intense that you can get. We'll continue kind of looking at this idea of connotation and denotation as we continue through the year, but start thinking about how some words have more meaning to them. Now, if English is not your first language, this is going to be a little bit more of a struggle to kind of find. Make sure you're looking at other context clues in the sentence that can kind of help you understand exactly how intense or how lightly a word is being taken, right? So if I didn't know that loathing was something intense, we know at first sight something happens. We know that these people are thinking about killing, right? So we can get to this idea that loathing is something that's a little bit more intense. It will be a little trickier. Keep working through it. We'll get to it. But start thinking about this idea of connotation and denotation when we look at these words. And all the time, as we were pitching in red hot, as we were angry, we were keeping the women off him as best we could, for they were wild as harpies. I never saw a circle of such hateful faces. And there was the man in the middle with a kind of black, sneering coolness. Frightened, too, I could see that, but carrying it off, sir, really like Satan, right? That's kind of intense. He's calling him the devil right there. If you choose to make capital out of this accident, said he, I am naturally helpless. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene, he says. Name your figure. Right? Name your figure. So it's the family that's basically saying we want a payout, right? They're kind of trying to blackmail this gentleman into paying for hitting their kid. Do the ends justify the means? Right? So he gets money, which might end up helping the girl with things like paying for the doctor who came. The doctor would not be free at this time. They're paying for the doctor who came. They might pay for, it might really help the family, really. But is it justified in the fact that the family is the one who is asking for the money? The family is blackmailing this gentleman. Is that right? Think about this idea, court cases that we see in the media, right? Some people get really big payouts for pain and suffering. Is it worth it? Is it right to have it that way? Maybe, because they're going through the court system, but is it right to almost, in this case, we're blackmailing? Pay us, or we're going to ruin your name. So really, where does the evil belong to? Is it the family who is blackmailing Mr. Hyde or this figure? Or is it Mr. Hyde who is really the more evil one here? To what degree and level of evil does the world live at, right? Is it Mr. Hyde or this gentleman is over here and the family maybe is over here with Mr. Utterson being here? I don't know. Okay. Name your figure. Well, we screwed him up to 100 pounds for the child's family. He would have clearly liked to stick out, but there was something about the lot of us that meant mischief, and at last he struck. The next thing was to get the money, and where do you think he carried us but to that place with the door? So this is the door that Mr. Enfield and Mr. Utterson are currently standing in front of, right? Mr. Enfield is telling the story to Mr. Utterson of what happened last week. Or some time ago. He whipped out a key, went in, and presently came back with a matter of 10 pounds in gold and a check for the balance on the courts drawn payable to the bearer and signed with a name I cannot mention. Okay, so Hyde goes in and comes out with a check or a promise for money from somebody that is not him, from somebody else. Though it's one of the points in my story, but it was a name at least very well known and often printed. It's someone who's well known in society. The figure was stiff, but the signature was good for more than that, if only it was genuine. I took the liberty of pointing out to my gentleman that the whole business looked apocryphal. Stumbling over a word. It looked like there was something wrong, and that a man does not in real life walk into a cellar door at 4 a.m. and come out of it with another man's check for close upon 100 pounds, right? So I just skipped over this one. We talked about this idea of if you choose to make capital out of this, who is more cruel, Hyde or the parents? Okay, but he was quite easy and sneering. Set your mind at rest, says he. I will stay with you till the banks open and cash the check myself. So we all set off, the doctor and the child's father and our father and myself, and passed the rest of the night in my chambers, and the next day, when we had breakfast, went in a body to the bank. I gave a check to myself and said I had every reason to believe it was a forgery. Not a bit of it. The check was genuine. Tut, tut, said Mr. Utterson. I see you feel as I do, said Mr. Enfield. Yes, it's a bad story, for my man was a fellow that nobody could have to do with, a really damnable man. And the person that drew the check is very pink of the proprieties, celebrated, too. He's someone who's very well known in society, somebody who is loved. Right? So Mr. Hyde came out with this promise of money, but it wasn't his name on it, it was this other person's name. Sir, Doctor, Honorable, right? This other person's name. It wasn't the man who grabbed the money, right? And what makes it worse? One of your fellows who do what they call good, right? So this bad man at 3 a.m. walked into somebody else's house and took this other man's. Let me give him a different color hat. This other man's money. And said, I will pay with this man's money. This man's not here. He's probably sleeping. But he's taking his money. So he's coming in, grabbing his money, and then leaving. But he says, no, I'm good for it. I'm good for it. Blackmail, I suppose, an honest man paying through the nose for some of the capers of his youth, for some of the errors of his youth, for some of the things that went wrong in his youth, right? So say, for example, this man right here, I don't know, had an affair with a woman, and then this man knew about it. So now he's still paying for it years later, right, to blackmail somebody. Blackmail house is what I call the place with the door, in consequence, even that, as you know, is far from explaining all. He added, with the words fell into a vein of musing. He started to think. Right. From this he was recalled by Mr. Utterson asking really suddenly, and you don't know if the drawer of the check lives there? Right? Do you know if that's his house? A likely place, isn't it? Returned Mr. Enfield. But I happen to have noticed his address. He lives in some square or another. You never asked about the place with the door? Said Mr. Utterson. No, sir, I had a delicacy, was the reply. I feel very strongly about putting questions. It partakes too much of a style of day of judgment. Right? I don't want to judge people. I don't want to ask questions. It's not my place. Right? And he says, you didn't ask about this before? He goes, no, sir, I had the delicacy. No, sir, I had a delicacy. Right? Think about what this means for Victorian England. This idea of having a delicacy not to ask. Right? I don't even ask what's wrong with my friend because it would be so indelicate. It wouldn't be proper. It wouldn't be part of a loud society. Right? I would be shunned. I would be kind of looked at funny because Mr. Enfield did not ask this honorable and right person what is going on. And Mr. Enfield continues on. He says, you start a question and it's like starting a stone. Okay, so he's sitting here saying, you start a question and it's like you're sitting on top of a hill. This is my hill. And he's like, it's like throwing a stone down the hill. You sit quietly on top of a hill, and away the stone goes, starting others, and presently, right here, this one, it hits a bigger stone, and then this one flies up, and it hits an even bigger stone. And presently some bland old bird, the last you would have thought of, is knocked on the head in his own back garden, and the family has to change their name. Right? So there's somebody sitting outside, and they get hit with this stone, and they die. And then now the entire family has to move and change their name because something happened. Now, this is kind of, he's making a story to make a point, really. He's saying you ask one question, and it's going to reveal a bigger truth, and it's going to reveal a bigger truth, until finally somebody gets hurt because somebody did something bad. We all have secrets to hide. We shouldn't be asking after them, because if that secret gets revealed, that person is as good as dead. Now they have to change their name, right? I ask, why wasn't, a student asked why another student wasn't at school yesterday. And they find out that they weren't at school because something was happening, but they don't know what. So they ask Johnny what's going on, and Johnny says, oh, well, something, this student was up to no good. Sally was up to no good. Oh, but I don't know what's going on. So they something's happening with her and Rachel, and so they ask Rachel, and they ended up finding out that Sally and Rachel robbed a store. Well, now Sally and Rachel are both in trouble, right? Their name has been tarnished in a way. So he doesn't like to kind of gossip because somebody's going to get hurt. Something is going to get revealed. A secret's going to come out. No, sir, I make it a rule of mine. The more it looks like Queer Street, the less I ask. A very good rule, too, said the lawyer. But I have studied the place for myself, continued Mr. Enfield. It seems scarcely a house. There's no other door. Nobody goes in or out of that one. But once in a great while, the gentleman of my adventure. There are 3 windows looking on the court on the first floor, and none below. The windows are always shut, but they're clean, and then there is a chimney, which is generally smoking, so somebody must live there. And yet it's not so sure, for the buildings are so packed together about the court that it's hard to say where one ends and another begins. The pair walked on again for a while in silence, and then Enfield, said Mr. Utterson. That's a good rule of yours. Yes, I think it is, Enfield, returned Enfield. But for all that, continued the lawyer, there's one point that I want to ask. I want to ask the name of the man who walked over the child. Well, said Mr. Enfield, I can't see what harm it would do. It was the name of Hyde. Okay, so now we know that it was Mr. Hyde. See, I didn't spoil it that much. Said Utterson. What sort of man is he to see? What does he look like? He is not easy to describe. There is something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarce know why. I don't know why I didn't like him, but as soon as I saw him, he was just downright detestable. Like, you hate, this kind of, again, this word of hate. He must be deformed somewhere, and we're going to talk about why he uses this word deformed. Now, keep in mind, again, Victorian society would have seen this very differently than we do today. And back then, and I'll go a little bit more into it later, this idea that the way you looked said something about you. Okay, so this idea that, for example, they thought that on your head, right, if you feel your head right now, there are like little lumps and bumps, and nobody's head's perfect. If you take a look at somebody who's bald, you'll notice that maybe they're like a little bumpier over here, maybe not to this degree, but these little bumps would tell you what is wrong with you, basically. And the more bumps that you have, and the lumpier and bumpier your head was, the more that was wrong with you. Right? So that's why they're saying he's deformed somewhere, because it's showing his evilness. He cannot contain it within himself. Okay, so he's deformed somewhere. He gives a strong feeling of deformity, although I couldn't specify the point. He can't say exactly where. Is it his nose that's really big? Does he have one small eye and one big eye? He can't say. He's an extraordinary looking man, and yet I really can name nothing out of the way. No, sir, I can make no hand of it. I can't describe him, and it's not for want of memory, for I declare it, I can see him at this moment. So why do you think right now that Stevenson's making this character that our Mr. Enfield cannot describe what he looks like? And we're going to see this throughout the story. Nobody could describe what he looks like. We're never going to get a nice picture of what Hyde looks like. Why? What is the point of having somebody that Stevenson's not describing what evil looks like for you? What does that allow you as the reader to do? Think about this. We're going to continue on with this idea as we go on. Almost there. Mr. Utterson again walked some way in silence and obviously under a weight of consideration. He was starting to think, Utterson. You are sure he used a key? He inquired at last. My dear sir, began Enfield, surprised out of himself. Yes, I know, said Utterson. I know it must seem strange. The fact is, if I do not ask you the name of the other party, because it is because I know it already. So I'm not asking who that sleeping man in the pink top hat is, right? I'm not asking who this is because I know it. I know who he is. You see, Richard, your tale has gone home, right? Your tale has come home. Something's hit home for me. If you have been inexact in any point, you had better correct it. I think you might have warned me, returned the other with a touch of sullenness, but I have been pedantically exact. To be pedantically means to be a pedant, which means to be overly specific or to be obsessed with minor details. So you want to be as exact as possible, as you call it. The fellow had a key, and what's more, he has it still. I saw him use it not a while ago. Sorry, they cut off. Mr. Utterson sighed deeply and never said a word, and then the young pair presently resumed. Here is another lesson to say nothing, said he. I am ashamed of my long tongue. Let me make a bargain never to refer to it again. Let us make a bargain never to refer to it again. He is very ashamed of his long tongue. He's ashamed of, how long he's talked. Because he's told the story for a really long time. He's ashamed of how much he's gossiped. He says, let's never talk about it again. With all my heart, said Utterson. I shake my hands on it with you, Mr. Enfield. Okay, so we end the story here. The door has been opened. That's my open door. Okay, the door has been opened. Hyde has been let out. The story has started. Okay, we're going to continue on. I will continue to film through the chapters. Hopefully this was a nice review for you for some of the things that we've gone over in class. Hopefully you were able to take some notes. I know this was a little bit long. And I will see you guys for chapter 2.